Hi, class. This is the lecture where we finally get to the United States declaring its independence from the British. It's kind of been a long time coming. We've been planting a lot of seeds along the way leading up to this moment. Uh, so, here is a lecture where we get to the final steps that the United States goes through, or the American colonies go through, before deciding to declare their independence and become the United States of America. One thing to note at the beginning of this lecture is that this is still not a foregone conclusion that we're going to declare independence. In fact, there's going to be a year of fighting between 1775 and 1776, where essentially we're fighting the War of Independence while at the same time trying to restore our rights as Englishmen and don't want to have this independence. So it's interesting to think that we're basically fighting a war for independence before we even realize it. So the main idea is a pretty short one this time. It's basically the idea that the tension between the British and her American colonies will reach a breaking point in the 1770s. And as you'll notice from the notes, again, we're going to go through a sort of timeline of events that will lead us up to the Declaration of Independence. I will take a moment to talk about some key parts of the Declaration of Independence, both how they relate to things like previous items like natural rights and compact theory and Enlightenment ideology, but I'll also point to some of the lingering effects of the Declaration of Independence, especially the phrase that is famous from it, where Thomas Jefferson says, quote, all men are created equal. And I'll talk about the long-term effects of that quote. Okay, on to the third round of tension. And I told you that tension kind of came round by round. Well, here's the round where the tension does reach a breaking point. And interestingly, round three arguably is started more by the colonists than by the British actions. So, what the colonists are going to do in 1772, and this is 2 years after the Boston Massacre trial had concluded, this is 2 years after the British soldiers had been found not guilty, you're going to see the colonists engage in a violent action. So this is known as the Gaspee Affair. The Gaspee was a British ship. It had been known to go around and capture smugglers. We've already talked about smuggling being an issue that the British were not a fan of. The Gaspee, for whatever reason, is going to run aground. I believe it was in Connecticut. And whenever that happens, it is going to be attacked and burned by colonists. And this starts to ratchet up the tension again. That's a physical, violent action that ratchets up the tension. Also, around this sort of this time, you're going to see the colonists start to be more intentional in their kind of behind Britain's back communication about Britain. So you're going to see committees of correspondence pick up. The colonists are going to start to communicate in secret. It's like they're writing secret notes to each other about British activities. And what this is going to do is it's going to help further unify the colonies. And now remember that the colonies at this point still do not officially seek independence. This is more about getting their rights as Englishmen back than it is about declaring independence. But you are seeing that the colonies are starting to unify more and they are resisting the British more. You will see, for example, the non-importation agreements continue the boycotts of British items. You will see public opinion, thanks to people like Samuel Adams and the propaganda of people like Samuel Adams. Uh, you're going to see that propaganda start to push more people to be even more disloyal to the British crown. And we've already talked about how that the British were, or the differences between the colonies and the British had, by the end of the last unit, kind of set up the colonies to be more considerate of independence. Even when the Declaration is finally signed, interestingly, less than half of Americans actually favor it being signed. More on that later. Okay, so round three begins with the British starting to raise tension. And then the British are going to try to be the peacemakers in a sense. What they're going to do is they are going to pass a law that's known as the Tea Act. Now, usually people look at the Tea Act and they think of it as a brand new tax on British tea that made it even more expensive and it was going to increase the colonies trying to smuggle their way around it. Well, what's interesting to note is that this Tea Act, in fact, was a lowering of the tax on tea that was already in place. The idea of the British was that if they made the tax so low, they could make it lower than the smuggled tea, and it would encourage colonists to basically uh, do things the legal way, to buy the non-smuggled tea. However, in the eyes of the colonists, this was no good. As you can see from the picture there is an example of tarring and feathering occurring. In the background, you can see some British tea being dumped out of a boat, which should alert you to the fact that we're about to get to a famous party in 1773. More on that in a second. So basically, the colonist reaction to the Tea Act, even though it made legal tea cheaper, was that this was just yet another example of taxation without representation. They had had no say in the passage of the Tea Act, and so they are going to be irritated by uh, this act, even though it made the tea cheaper. So you'll see here in the notes it says that the colonists were mad and felt forced to buy British tea. Again, this is basically another example of no taxation without representation. Cheaper or not, it was a matter of principle at this point. So in 1773, there's going to be in Boston Harbor, and remember that Boston is kind of the hotbed of a lot of revolutionary ideas and actions. In 1773, you'll see the occurrence of the Boston Tea Party. And colonists, they're going to disguise themselves as Native Americans. I'm not sure why, because I doubt that they are really fooling anybody. But what they're going to do is they're going to go on a British ship that contained 342 chests of tea that had been shipped in from Britain. This was tea that was supposed to be under the new Tea Act, so it should have been cheaper. However, the British colonists are going to basically refuse to take it. And then in March of 1773, I believe it was, no, it was December. In December of 73, the colonists are going to attack this ship in pretty much a non-violent way, and they are going to dump 342 chests into the Boston Harbor. Now, this is going to be the single greatest financial loss in a single day that the colonists had ever put on the British. In fact, I think the British had never suffered, it was millions of dollars worth of damage. And even today, if you go to the Boston Harbor, you can see samples of tea leaves in the harbor ground. Samuel Adams, who was again a famous revolutionary, he is going to defend this action in local newspapers. He is going to probably have participated in it, although there's no proof of it. Now, one thing to note is that they did not hurt anybody. The most violent thing they did was break open a padlock that was holding some of the tea chest in place, but they just dumped the tea out. They didn't even steal any of the tea. This was totally a political move to show resistance to the British Tea Act. Well, at this point, the king is going to be pretty mad because it's not just his laws that are being violated, it's also the pocketbook of Britain that's being hurt in this case. Like I said before, this was the most financially damaging day in British history, so far as I know. So the king is going to be a lot more heavy-handed than in the past. And as you can guess, the place that's in his crosshairs as a result of this party will be Boston, Massachusetts. So at this point, the British are going to decide it's time to punish the colonies, and to be more accurate, I should say, to punish Massachusetts, especially Boston. And both the King and Parliament are going to punish Boston by what's known as the Coercive Acts, or sometimes the Intolerable Acts. There's technically a difference between the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts, but for the sake of this class, we'll consider them to be the same thing, and it won't hurt anything. Okay, so these Coercive Acts, what they will do is they will specifically punish Boston. They will shut down Boston Harbor, which means no more trades going in and out of Boston, which is going to be an enormous financial hit to the Bostonians. They are going to be stripped of their ability to have their own elections, and basically the king is going to start appointing a governor and governing officials of Boston because he feels like they have proven unable to govern themselves. They have proven that they are going to be defiant of the king. And finally, if you look at this picture here, if you look at Boston and all these troops flooding in, you can tell that there's going to be a need for a bigger quartering act. There's going to be even more soldiers that are going to need housing and food, which of course is just going to make the Bostonians more angry. So it's kind of, in my mind, hard to pin blame on one side or the other, because basically one side does something that angers the other, and the other responds by doing something that angers the first side, and they're kind of both upping the ante. And as I said before, more British troops are going to be sent in to keep order. And remember, this is a few years after the Boston Massacre, and we already know how the colonists reacted to the the British troops during the time of the Boston Massacre. Here, you're going to see the tension go up even further. And at this point, you're going to see the people of Boston, the people of Massachusetts start looking out to other colonies. And remember, the colonies had already been corresponding through the committees of correspondence, and the people of Massachusetts are going to start asking for help. They're hoping that the colonies will take the side of Massachusetts instead of the side of King George III and Parliament. And that's a pretty big hope because remember, in a lot of the colonies, King George III and Parliament were getting along just fine, especially in the southern colonies. So at this point, the colonies are going to call these coercive acts intolerable acts because they think they are not tolerable. You'll see cartoons like this one being shown where you see the colonies being shown as a woman that's being taken advantage of by the British, stripped of her clothing, being forced to drink this tea. And again, the colonists are going to up the ante. They're not going to want to back down either. However, they're not wanting war. They're not wanting independence. So the committees of correspondence that I told you about already that were in place are going to send letters out to the other colonies and tell the colonies to send delegates. Now remember, delegates is another term for representatives. So basically, they're going to ask that the colonies send representatives and meet as a Congress and discuss how to respond to this. Now, obviously, Massachusetts has a lot to say about the response, and Massachusetts is pretty upset, but not all of the colonists are quite as upset. So it's pretty interesting to note that in the end, these colonies are going to agree that independence is the right move, even though a lot of them were not direct targets, at least not yet. Of course, I could counter argue that by pointing out the fact that a lot of southern colonies had been upset with the proclamation of 1763 for quite some time. So you have a meeting which is known as the First Continental Congress, and this is a simple, peaceful meeting of the colonies. They each send delegates, they each send representatives, and they meet in a kind of middle of the road colony. They meet in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. And as some of you know, this is where the Declaration of Independence will ultimately be signed, later on the Constitution. So Philadelphia is very instrumental in the beginning of our country's history. In fact, whenever they decide to declare independence, Philadelphia will be the first capital of the United States. And then eventually New York, and then eventually Washington, D.C., where it is today. So what's the purpose of this meeting? The purpose of this meeting is to discuss a formal response to what they call the Intolerable Acts. And one thing to note, you might want to highlight this one or underline this one or put it in bold. The delegates are not meeting to declare independence. Independence is far from most people's minds at this point. What they are meeting to do is to get their rights as Englishmen back. So basically, Boston wants the harbor to be opened again. Boston wants the right to self-government that they've since been stripped of because of the coercive or intolerable acts. So this was all about getting the rights of Englishmen back at this point, or at least mostly about that. However, they did have a sort of contingency plan. They did say, well, we should be ready just in case things get worse instead of better. So one thing that you will see is that they will announce the Declaration of Resolves, which formally condemn the coercive acts, which is a pretty, in the eyes of the king, a pretty disrespectful thing to do. They're going to announce boycotts or non-importation agreements. So again, they condemn what the king and parliament are doing here. They announce that they're not going to buy British goods until things get better. But at the same time, they express loyalty to the king. So again, they want their rights not as Americans, but they want their rights as Englishmen. They want to be treated as if they were citizens, and they're increasingly starting to feel as if they're not. And eventually that'll boil over into the creation of the Declaration of Independence. But again, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that there was sort of a backup plan that these members of the Continental Congress are going to have, and this backup plan was, well, let's go ahead and start creating local militias within our colonies just in case things get worse, just in case the British soldiers start to abuse their power. And so you have these colonial militias. A militia is kind of like a mini army, a private army, you could almost say. It might just apply to a certain county or to a certain town. It's not going to apply to the entire country. Sometimes an entire colony could potentially create a militia, but these are kind of these small groups of soldiers. Think of it almost like volunteer firefighters. So, in every town in this country, so far as I know, you have a group of people that work as volunteer firefighters. There's no national firefighting force, but they are there just in case there's a local need, a local emergency. And that's basically what these militias were there for, just in case something came up that required immediate military action. Now, notice that they are nicknamed the Minutemen. They were nicknamed the Minutemen because, just like volunteer firefighters today, they were expected to be ready in a minute's notice for any sort of emergency. And pretty soon I'm going to tell you about a famous time in which the Minutemen are going to find themselves standing toe-to-toe against the most powerful soldiers in the world, the British Army. That'll be at Lexington and Concord. First, let's get to how King George III reacts to the First Continental Congress. Now, from his point of view, they are expressing disrespect by condemning the coercive acts. They're announcing boycotts, which is again a disrespectful thing that hurts their pocketbooks. And they're creating their own little groups of soldiers, which King George III would say, your soldiers are my soldiers. You don't have a separate army. So what King George III at this point is going to do is he's going to be very angry, and he's going to declare Massachusetts colony to be in rebellion, which is basically a kind of foreshadowing of him pretty in the near future declaring all the colonies in rebellion. And when this happens, he says it's time to punish Massachusetts even further. And so what he does is he's going to send even more troops to Massachusetts to suppress any sort of defiance. Now, what's interesting is that in the past, Parliament and King George III were willing to back down for the sake of peace. Remember, after the Boston Massacre, King George III and Parliament brought the troop levels down. Now they're bringing the troop levels up. So again, King George III and Parliament are increasingly losing patience with what they see as colonial defiance. From the colonial point of view, this defiance would never take place if their rights as Englishmen were being respected to begin with, if their rights to govern themselves with local legislatures like they were used to for decades, if that was being respected. So you can see an argument made by both sides on why the tension goes up. Regardless of who's at fault, the tension does go up. And so at this point, British troops again are going to be officially sent into, or even more are going to be sent into Boston. And they're going to be led by a general named Thomas Gage. And what Thomas Gage is going to be tasked with doing is going to one of the towns outside of Massachusetts, which was called Concord. Today, people would say that's a mispronunciation, but Concord, Massachusetts, that's how it's pronounced. He is going to be sent to go to Concord. What's in Concord? Well, a lot of these militia, these Minutemen militia supplies, like maybe gunpowder are being held, maybe weapons are being held. There are rumors that some of the leaders of this rebellion, people like Samuel Adams, who's been trying to lead this rebellion basically since the Boston Massacre, other rebel ringleaders like John Hancock. John Hancock was probably the richest man in all the colonies, and he had made a lot of his money through smuggling, which of course King George III was not a fan of. So these two men, for varying reasons, were not a big fan of the king's recent policies. They were considered ringleaders of the rebel groups, and so there's a twofold reason for sending these troops outside of Boston. One is to go to Concord to get the military supplies or the militia supplies that the Minutemen held, and also the idea was cut the head off the snake. If you take out Sam Adams, if you take out John Hancock, then the rebel leaders the rebels won't have their leaders anymore, and their movement will fall apart. I mean, look at Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion fell apart as soon as Nathaniel Bacon died. So as soon as these troops left Boston, heading into the Massachusetts countryside towards Concord, you will see people like Paul Revere. There were others, but Paul Revere is the most famous. And they are going to make their famous midnight rides. They were riding ahead of the British troops to warn any of the Minutemen, any of the rebel leaders, people in Concord, that the British troops were coming. Now, technically, the quote is that the redcoats are coming, which was a reference to the uniform of the British, but people typically remember Paul Revere's uh, ride, his midnight ride, as being one in which he said that the British were coming. Uh, Tomato, tomato, same difference. Basically, he's warning that the British are coming to try to stop and suppress any kind of rebel activity or rebel leaders. And he is successful in warning lots of people in Massachusetts about the British approach. In fact, the place that he is probably most effective is going to be in Lexington. Now, if you saw a map, and I do have a map in a moment that I can show you, but if you saw a map, you'd basically see that on the way to Concord, there is a town called Lexington outside of Boston. So both of these towns are outside of Boston. The troops are going to get to Lexington first. And Minutemen, at a moment's notice, had assembled, and they do intercept the British troops. Now, what's interesting is that the British troops way outgunned the Minutemen, and the British troops basically said to the Minutemen, I think the phrase was disperse all ye rebels. They basically told the Minutemen to go home. And this is the equivalent almost of the American military today meeting a crowd of angry farmers with pitchforks and torches. And if you're a smart farmer, you're not going to try to fight the military with pitchforks and torches. And so the Minutemen actually began to turn and leave and back down to the British. And then, almost mysteriously, a gunshot goes off. No one knows who fired the shot, but this shot is going to be responded to by the British troops with several shots. And in the end, 8 Minutemen are going to lay dead. Now, this shot that occurs is going to famously later on be referred to as the shot heard round the world. This is a very pro-United States, pro-colony painting you see here. Arguably, the Minutemen would have been running away. They would not have been standing quite so proudly to fight back. In fact, this picture might be from what happened in Concord, or on the surprise attack at Concord later on. So this attack on the Lexington Minutemen, which started with what may well have been an accidental shot, no one knows who shot it or why, but what happens is basically the British troops are going to fire upon the Minutemen, and a lot of people consider this to be the beginning of the American Revolution, which is interesting because it was more of a massacre than it was a battle, and it was in 1775, over a year before the Declaration of Independence was ever signed. So remember how I said that the War of Independence had begun over a year before the Declaration had been signed? Most historians would consider this to be the beginning of the American Revolution. So after the remaining Minutemen from Lexington fled, the British went on to Concord, and they did manage to attack a lot of the supplies that were held by the Minutemen. And as they were leaving, the Minutemen of Concord are going to attack. And they are going to attack in an ambush, a surprise ambush, over 400 of them. And they are going to put the British troops on the run. They're going to kill nearly 100 of them, injure more, and run them all the way back to Boston. Now, this is an extremely bold act of defiance by the Minutemen, especially considered that they were not nearly as trained or as disciplined. They were not nearly as well weaponized as the British soldiers, yet by act of surprise, they were able to send them running all the way back to Boston. And at this point, it would not be pleasant to be a British troop in Boston, because from out of the woods, from all corners, you saw local militias, including that from Concord, start to surround Boston. Now, Boston's on the coast. Boston's almost kind of on a peninsula. And so basically what you'll see, if you look at a map, is you'll see that Boston is surrounded on one side by ocean, on 3 sides by these local militias that aren't really wanting to let these British troops leave Boston. So you have a very nasty, potentially nasty, very tense standoff now occurring between the local militias and the British troops who have at this point been surrounded. So one thing that's worth noting, well, let me show you the map first. So you'll see here, this is where the Boston troops came out, and again, Paul Revere had ran ahead on horseback, And then you can see that ultimately they're trying to get to over here where Concord is. Here's where the first shot heard around the world is, Lexington. So the British troops are going to leave. They're heading towards Concord. They get stopped at Lexington. It looks like it's going to end peacefully. Then shots get fired, and then the British are going to move on to Concord. And after they go to Concord, they are going to be attacked on their way out and run all the way back to Boston. So if you follow the mouse, you basically see the route. Now, at this point, here's where the British troops are, and all around Boston, you see the militias come out of the woods to basically surround them and dare them to try to leave the city again. And the question is, will they try to leave? Will they try to fight back against the militia? And the answer ultimately is going to be yes. And that'll be the Battle of Bunker Hill, which I'll get to shortly. So, at the conclusion of the First Continental Congress, the delegates had agreed that if things did not get better, then they would have a second meeting. Things obviously have not gotten better. The colony of Massachusetts has been called to be an open rebellion. You've seen violence at Lexington and Concord. So now you're going to see a second Continental Congress. It's this Congress that's going to ultimately declare independence. But again, let me emphasize, not yet. They are, however, going to get bolder. So at the Second Continental Congress, again held in Philadelphia, you will see the colonies, if you will, adopt all of these militias and merge them into one giant army known as the Continental Army. And they are going to name someone that you've all heard of as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and that will be George Washington. Now, George Washington was not a military genius whatsoever. He actually lost more battles than he won overall, but what he had more than most people was leadership qualities. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and everyone stood up a little bit straighter. He commanded respect just by the way that he was, and so even though he was not a good tactician when it came to fighting, even though he did not win all the battles, he was considered a great leader who made great leadership decisions at just the right moments in history, and when it came to wins, he got the wins that really mattered. So ultimately, this does prove to be a pretty good choice by the Second Continental Congress, despite the fact that George Washington's military career had not always been so successful. If you need more evidence, just look at the French and Indian War, where he had not done too well, and he really hadn't led any troops since then. But again, leadership qualities can go a long way, and they definitely do for George Washington. At this point, and again, you might want to underline this or put this in bold or put a star next to it, Congress does still, they still do not want to have independence. They still want to reconcile with England. They still want to have their restoration of their rights of Englishmen. Although, as you can probably guess, after Lexington and Concord, it's going to be a lot harder to get King George III to listen to anything the colonists say about peace. And it's about to get worse. So what's interesting is that the Second Continental Congress at this point is going to send a letter to King George III and specifically say, basically, we're sorry about the fighting. We're sorry about what happened at Concord. We're sorry that we have this army that we have now raised against you. We're only doing it because we want you to give us back our rights and our local government, like we've gotten used to for so many years. So what's interesting is that despite all of this tension, and it's still going to get worse, despite the fighting that's taken place already, Congress is officially sending out an olive branch, which is usually seen as a symbol of peace, and they are telling the king that they really want to stay part of England. They still want to maintain their loyalty to the king. They want to make things right. So the relationship is going downhill, but the Second Continental Congress wants to make one last ditch effort to try to heal the damaged relationship with King George III. Unfortunately for the colonists, or maybe fortunately for the future of the United States, there's going to be one other violent military event that's going to happen, and the news of that event is going to reach King George III at about the same time that the Olive Branch Petition arrives in England, and that will be the Battle of Bunker Hill. So at the Battle of Bunker Hill, remember I mentioned a few moments ago that the British troops were surrounded. The British troops were in Boston and the Boston area. They were about right in this region that I'm pointing out here. And there was a colonial militia on Breed's Hill. Technically speaking, this is the Battle of Breed's Hill, but people misnamed it for the neighboring hill, which is Bunker Hill, so it becomes known as Bunker Hill. Regardless, this will be a very significant battle in the early history of the American Revolution. So at this point, the British troops are going to decide we aren't going to be cornered in the city of Boston or any surrounding area by this ragtag group of Minutemen. And so what happens, and you'll see it better in a painting in a moment, what happens is that the British troops that are right here are going to try to march up this hill towards the Minutemen. And the problem with marching uphill towards an enemy is that the enemy with the high ground always has the advantage. So again, the British troops are going to try to attack Breed's Hill and what becomes known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. And it was a very unwise move, probably because of their arrogance, probably because they were such a strong army, they thought they could take on the Continental Army. What ends up happening is that the Continental Army is going to deliberately allow for the British troops to get extremely close to the top of the hill before they fire upon them. I believe this is the battle where the commanding officer says, quote, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So the Continental Army is going to basically bait the British Army up the hill till they are within very close firing range, and then they're going to unleash all the ammunition that they have. And when I say all the ammunition that they have, I mean it literally, because that's what ends up losing the battle for the colonists and the Continental Army. They simply run out of ammo, but not before doing extremely heavy damage to the strongest army in the world. So they do manage to do a lot of damage to the British troops before being forced to retreat further into Massachusetts off the coast. So even though this was a military loss, it was a big morale boost. It was a big military victory because the colonists did a heck of a lot more damage than the British Army ever would have thought they could. And so this really gives a lot of confidence to this newly formed Continental Army that maybe they can indeed declare independence someday. Still, again, not wanting to declare independence. So this battle happens. It is very bad for the British. There you can see a picture of the British troops as they're marching up the hill, which is, by today's standards, a very dumb move. You can see the militiamen at the top firing down. And again, they do a lot of damage to the British, even though they ultimately lose. So what this is going to do is it is going to boost the confidence of those that were starting to think about independence, or at least those that were willing to fight to restore the rights of Englishmen. At the same time, this is pretty much the final straw for King George III. So King George III hears about this battle at the same time that he gets the Olive Branch Petition. And remember, the Olive Branch Petition said, hey, we're sorry about all the fighting, we just want our rights as Englishmen back. If you're the King of England at this point, you're not really willing to listen to any kind of apologies. You're not willing to listen to this idea that the colonists want to restore peace. If you're the king, you felt like you've just been punched in the face with one person's hand, and now they're holding out their other hand to shake hands with you. And you're probably going to remember the punch to the face more. So at this point, he declares not just Massachusetts, but all of the colonies to be an open rebellion, since all the colonies were contributing troops to this newly formed Continental Army. And thus, you see the response to the Battle of Bunker Hill is not a positive one. The Olive Branch Petition is going to be thrown out the window. Now, what's interesting is that even now that the king has declared all of the colonies an open rebellion, even though the Second Continental Congress has formed its own army, still there are not enough Americans in favor of independence in order for any declaration of independence to be made. That's about to change. So again, even though this happens by 1776, most colonists are still not sure about declaring independence. They think it's a bad idea to try to declare independence from the most powerful military in the world, which is a good point to make. If you declare independence from this country, you're going to lose your trade relationship with it, and for good or ill, there's a lot of money to be made with England. There's a lot of protection that comes from the British Navy and military, and now you are turning your back against it, and it's about to stop protecting you and start attacking you. So, what turns enough people in favor of independence is going to be the writing of a man named Thomas Paine. So, Thomas Paine's going to write a pamphlet called Common Sense, and he is going to push for independence. He is going to talk about all the things that the Parliament had done that violated the rights of Englishmen. He's going to borrow from Enlightenment ideology and talk about how natural rights are being violated. He's going to talk about how, since the British have violated natural rights and they have therefore broken the compact that is part of the compact theory. So, what Common Sense did is it put in everyday language at the time a argument for why the colonists should be independent from England, and it was largely based on the idea that the rights of Englishmen, which at this point could kind of be merged with natural rights, either way, their rights were being violated by the king. Their natural rights, rights of Englishmen, both. Either way, he's going to say that all of these rights are being violated by the King of England, and they are violating our life, our liberty, our right to property, as John Locke would have said. And there are some good examples of that. The right to life was violated by what happened at Bunker Hill or at Lexington. You could talk about the Boston Massacre even. He's going to say that rights to freedom, right to liberty. Well, remember in Boston they had been deprived of their local governments. They had been deprived of their right to use the Boston Harbor to trade. And then finally, the right of property. You could argue that that right had been taken away by all the taxes that were being passed without colonial representation. So again, Thomas Paine is going to argue through his pamphlet Common Sense that natural rights are being violated and that a government's responsibility primarily is to protect natural rights. That's the compact theory. And then he argues that the King of England has not been protecting natural rights, thus has violated the compact, thus independence should be declared. Now what's interesting is that Thomas Paine doesn't say, let's throw off this government and have no new government to replace it with. He actually does have an idea, and I'll get to that in a moment. So again, basically he's going to say that all of these British actions that I've been talking about in the last couple of lectures all violate natural rights, and therefore the government of Britain is no longer legitimate and no longer has a right to rule over the colonists. What's the new government going to be to replace it? Some might have asked, and Thomas Paine's answer would be a republic. And this is a very big turning point in American history, because this completely turns on the head a lot of ideas that people had had about kings in the past. A lot of people used to think that because God had put the king in power, then whatever the king said went. So basically, power came from the king and went to the people. Well, a republic is the opposite. Let me repeat. A republic turns the authority of a king on its head. It is the opposite of the idea of a monarchy. So in a republic, Thomas Paine says power should come from the people through elections and not from a king. So if you wanted to be accurate about what kind of government we have in the United States today, you would say we have a democratic republic. We have a republic that operates through democratic elections. So we elect people to govern on our behalf, and if they do not respect our natural rights, if they violate compact theory, we may well vote these people out of office. So as a result of Paine's work, which is really a two-parter, one part's about why independence should be declared, the other part was what new government should take the place of King George III and his parliament, the Republic. As a result of his pamphlet, the idea of independence becomes popular enough to where the Second Continental Congress seriously begins to think about declaring independence, even more so whenever they hear about more battles that take place and the way that the king is using the military to invade other parts of the colonies. He's about to take over New York, for example. He's taken over Boston already. So now the question is, who is going to write this Declaration of Independence? And at the fairly young age of 33, it's going to be Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is a picture of Jefferson much later on when he was President of the United States, so he doesn't look 33 here, but he was 33 when he wrote the Declaration. So in the Declaration of Independence, well, let me rewind for a second. In the Second Continental Congress, there were people that were in favor of declaring independence and those that still were wanting to hold out because of the risks involved. And there were a lot of risks. For example, the fact that if you declare independence and lose, you're going to be hanged first by the king whenever you lose the war. In the Continental Congress, someone from the Boston area and a future president, John Adams, will be probably the biggest pusher for declaring independence. However, his personality was not the most popular with a lot of other people in the Congress. He wasn't that well liked. He was kind of seen as a loudmouth. He was known as being sometimes, quote, obnoxious and disliked. So even though he pushes for independence, the idea is that someone else should actually write this declaration. One other reason that people said someone besides John Adams should write this declaration is because John Adams was from Massachusetts, and if you're going to get the southern colonies on board, maybe you should pick a southerner. In fact, one of the reasons George Washington was picked was because he was a southerner. He was from Virginia. And so that helped bring southern colonies more into the cause, knowing that one of their own was going to help lead the army. Same idea is that the Second Continental Congress is going to end up picking Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, a southerner from Virginia, and if he declares independence, then that's going to help the South be more supportive of this. So on July the 4th of 1776, Second Continental Congress is going to declare its decision, which was technically made 2 days before, to become independent from Britain. Now, when this happens, you don't just say we're going to be independent. You have to declare it formally, and you have to explain why. And that's why the Southern colonist, the Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, was so important. He explained very eloquently the Declaration and the reasons for it. So many of you have read excerpts of the Declaration of Independence. It's one of the most famously quoted documents in world history. Let's take a look at a little bit about it. There's the whole thing. Obviously you can't read it, but there it is. Thomas Jefferson, again, will be the one that writes the Declaration of Independence. And he's going to talk about natural rights. He's going to talk about the idea that all men are created with unalienable rights, is what he calls them, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he basically plagiarizes John Locke. And then he starts talking about compact theory. But even when he's talking about compact theory, he's going to give specific ways in which the king has violated the compact. He's going to call out the king by name and list dozens of reasons why this Declaration of Independence was necessary. Now, from this bullet, you can see that there's an arrow that comes from it, and it relates to the phrase that he used called, that's known as all men are created equal. I'm going to spend an entire separate box talking about the notion of all men being created equal, because whether he meant for it to be used later on or not, this phrase will be used a lot to talk about the rights of minority groups, such as Black Americans, such as enslaved Black Americans, such as women. And sometimes these issues persist all the way into American history too. More on that in a moment. So Thomas Jefferson, like Thomas Paine, like John Locke, spoke of compact theory and natural rights. Jefferson basically expands upon Thomas Paine's work and talks about how the British had broken the compact with the colonies. He gives plenty of examples of it. We've already seen plenty of examples of it, like the Quartering Act, for example, or the Coercive Acts / Intolerable Acts, etc., etc. And at this point, there were enough people in the Second Continental Congress, and remember the Second Continental Congress represented all the colonies. Every single colony had representatives there, and at this point, they are going to sign, as you can see here at the bottom, they are going to sign the Declaration. John Hancock did write his name the biggest. He wanted the king to be able to read it apparently without his glasses. But you will see the names of other people. If you look here, I'm pointing out John Adams, for example, who had pushed for this declaration. And there are several others there. Thomas Jefferson's in there somewhere. I'm just struggling to find it at the moment, but that's okay. Okay, so at this point, the colonies now have officially declared independence. A year after the fighting had occurred or began with Lexington and Concord, now you see the actual declaration to go with it. At this point, the colonies consider themselves officially a separate country, and they consider themselves to be the United States of America. Now, what's interesting, though, is that you can declare independence all you want, but unless you obtain it, it means nothing. The southern states tried to declare independence from the government in the American Civil War, but they never obtained it. So you have to fight the war to earn this independence that you have declared. And so now the American Revolution, which had unofficially began a year before, officially begins with this declaration. However, it will take a war to secure it. The subject of the next lecture will be all about the war itself and how the United States managed to win against the biggest military in or the most powerful military in the world. Now let's go back to this one phrase from the Declaration of Independence that's especially important, and that is the idea of all men being created equal. So if you were to look back in the notes, you saw that part of the Declaration declared that all men were created equal. But during the Revolution and after the Revolution, there are many groups of people that are not treated equally. Very noticeably is the fact that black Americans, especially in the southern states, will remain slaves for a very long time, and they will be denied their natural rights of life and liberty and property or the pursuit of happiness. In fact, they were considered property by the southern states. What's interesting is that the northern states, after reading words like all men are created equal, will either immediately or gradually get rid of slavery. And part of the reason for that is because the northern states were not as addicted to slavery because they did not need agriculture to survive as much as the southern states did. So what's interesting is that for the duration of this class, nearly the entire duration of this class, blacks are going to remain as slaves, despite the fact that our country is founded partially on this idea of all men being created equal. Even after the Civil War is done, blacks, especially in the South, are going to be denied many rights by southern state governments and sometimes northern state governments, all the way, and this is not a typo, all the way until the 1960s. You have all heard of Martin Luther King Jr. He is one of the major figures of American history, too, that finally kind of holds our country accountable to one of the founding ideals that all men are created equal. More on that idea later. Also, women. Whenever you hear a phrase like all men are created equal, usually it's implying all humans are created equal. A lot of women are going to question whether or not they are supposed to be included in this Declaration of Independence, and many of them are going to be denied rights for a very long time. After the American Revolution, they're going to ask for the right to vote. They don't get it. The Civil War comes and goes. Only a few states give it to them. Women will not be given the rights of men until 1920. And arguably, even today, in the 2000s, black Americans and female Americans do not see as much equality as some other groups of Americans. So this is going to, whether or not Thomas Jefferson meant to kind of create this ongoing narrative of equality in the United States back when he wrote the Declaration in 1776, this theme of all men being created equal and all humans being created equal, that notion has come up again and again in American history, basically any time any group is not being given equality. So I'm planting a major seed in this slide, not just related to the rest of American History 1, but a lot of it will apply to American History 2 in the future. This notion of all men being created equal. Okay, so let's finish this lecture up before we get to the actual war by kind of setting up the sides. There were lots of American colonists that did not want to declare independence because they knew it was a tough task. These were known as loyalists, and they remained loyal to Britain throughout the war, and they were a substantial number of the colonists. They were about a third of the colonists. Whenever it came to these people, they typically lived in New York. New York had made a lot of money trading with Britain. That doesn't stay that way forever because eventually the king and parliament are going to decide to invade New York and take it over. And that'll turn a lot of New Yorkers against Britain. The lower South, a lot of people in the South had not had much of a problem with Britain. The people that had a problem with the proclamation of 1763 were mainly in Virginia, people like George Washington. The deeper South is not going to be so against the king. They are going to remain largely loyalist, but eventually, kind of like with New York, King George is going to go after Charleston, invade South Carolina, uh, partially invade North Carolina, and so a lot of these areas will go and become against Britain eventually. So when I'm telling you about the number of loyalists, this is the number of people that were loyalists at the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, a lot fewer people are loyalists because basically other areas of the colonies got a taste of what had already happened in Massachusetts. When the British troops come in, people aren't going to be happy no matter where in the colonies they come in. Okay? The people that were in favor of independence were known as the Patriots, and they tended to be in the New England area, which I'm pointing at here in the map. And that makes sense because this is where a lot of the laws, especially Massachusetts, where a lot of laws have been passed that upset the colonists. The one other area would probably be Virginia, and that's because Virginia, again, had been denied a lot of land that they thought that they should have by the Proclamation of 1763. Notice how many were in favor of independence at the time that the Declaration of Independence was signed. Only about 40%. But again, the longer that this war drags on, the higher that percentage will get as American colonists get more and more angry with the British troop presence. And again, their location tended to be in the New England area, especially Massachusetts, near Boston, where unpopular taxes had been placed, where you'd had things like the Boston Massacre, where you'd had the Quartering Act passed, etc. But also Virginia. Virginia was unhappy because of the Proclamation of 1763, which was still officially denying them land, even though a lot of them were ignoring the line anyway. There were some people that kind of lived out in the backwoods or out in the mountain areas that didn't really know what was going on, and they didn't really care either way. That would make up the remaining percentage of the colonists. One other and final thing to point out is that in a sense, or not in a sense, but in a very real sense, this was a civil war. This was a section of British-owned land, people that were English by citizenship largely, that were suddenly saying, we don't want to be part of England anymore. We don't want to be part of Britain anymore. We want to secede from Britain, if you will. So this is a civil war, kind of like the American Civil War was, except in this case, the group of people that wanted to break away ultimately were successful and did form their own country. As you know, in the American Civil War, the Confederacy never got to completely separate from the federal government, and they ended up losing the Civil War. But remember that this American Revolution is a civil war between loyalists and between patriots, and of course the British Army that was there to back up the loyalists. But let me point out again that at the beginning of the American Revolution, on paper, it did not look good for people like Thomas Jefferson, people like John Adams, people like Ben Franklin, who was also at the Second Continental Congress, people like George Washington that was leading the army against the British Army. So on paper, especially, the Patriots were not likely to win, and they were not even in the majority in their own declared country. So the next lecture we'll pick up talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the two sides of this war, the major significant battles of the war, and the strategies used during the war, and then the end of the war, which, as you should know, ended with the United States officially being recognized as an independent nation.